Good morning, creatives, right? So I was, when I was thinking about the title for the talk, I was in a shower about a week ago, and I've done a few versions of this talk because of this project that I'm mostly going to talk about today. I've done a few versions of it, and I've added a few things that I think make it relevant even more so, I think, to the theme, but also kind of tie it back to kind of a broader perspective about the concept of form. So I'm going to kind of expand a little bit. I'm hoping so much that I get through all of the slides in 20 minutes. So we're going to be seeing a lot of eye candy and move through the center a little quicker than the front and the back. So just a little bit of context. As Celeste was saying, the last foray I had was about a 4 or 5 year jaunt with a thing called the Form Studio. And it was a studio created for sophomores, primarily in industrial design, which is also known as product design, depending on what university you're at. So I jumped into this because I was at a point in my teaching career where I was really unsatisfied with product design in the field and where it was going, and the accumulation of consumerism and what I considered to be waste, the kind of overconsumption, the over-design of stuff. And I wasn't kind of figuring out why that was happening in education, why we weren't doing something about that. And kind of simultaneous to that moment, I had the pleasure of meeting someone named Joseph Ballet, who started a phenomenon that I think he's actually writing a book about now called Form Families. And he came to visit Virginia Tech and did a few stints with us, and it kind of changed my whole approach to education at that time. So the work that you're going to see here is from a body of 4 years, all sophomore work, I'll tell you that. Much of the photography that you see is from a group of 20 students who developed the exhibit that came out of this 4-year period. I'm not going to show images of the exhibition today, although you can see some of that online. But the work here is really primarily student stuff, and I have a few other things I've thrown into the mix. But one of the things I thought a lot about in that period of time was Michael Pollan's mantra, right? Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And I said if we thought about life a bit more like that, we could make stuff, not too much, mostly lean. And so part of it was beginning to get students to think about how can you let form tell you what not to do, right? So that was part of the mission of that Form Studio. So I'm going to ask this a few times throughout so that we can kind of try to use this to stay focused, because I'm going to talk about form in a number of different ways. The first thing that I would say is I had a colleague when I was teaching at Arizona State, so this was even a greater number of years ago, but we used to talk about it, right? But we didn't have great words we weren't using the word form, but we were talking about it. And we always knew it when we saw it. And we were talking about design, and I think what we were talking about, I think form is a word for that, but I think we were talking about a completely controlled idea, something that it was strung together, that wasn't superfluous, that was not extraneous. So I think that probably forms the basis of the thought and the work that I've done in this Form Studio. But he gave me this, a bit of an allegory once, and I've never forgotten, I still think about it a lot. So you walk into a bar, you have a beer, you pay for your beer, the bartender throws the change out on the bar, and you have this kind of strange moment, and you say, deja vu. And you don't know why. You're thinking, well, did I do this last week? Was I just here? Did I have a drink and I do the same thing in the same bar? And you realize that, no, that's not quite it, but there's something weird. You all know what it is to have that experience of deja vu. So what you realize, though, eventually, and this does happen sometimes, it certainly happened to me, but not often, at some point down the road, you realize what it was about that moment. So in this case, it might have been that it really was a pattern. It was an orchestration. You weren't looking at the coins. You weren't thinking about the beer that you just had. You weren't even thinking about money. You were really thinking about something that you saw recently, perhaps, that was that configuration. So the definition, I mean, and there's more scientific definition to this, but essentially it's, I've already seen this, I've already been there, I've already done this. It's a feeling of knowing, right? You know something, you know you've been here before. But really, it's about configuration, and that turns out not to be an easy thing to do, to remember something by configuration. So when it happens, I think it's fairly extraordinary, and I think that's why we have this kind of mental moment about deja vu, and we have this thing that we call this strange moment. So I think we can call it pattern, I think we can call it configuration. I like to think of it also as a form where all the extraneous stuff has gone away. And that's when it really becomes form to me, when everything else is stripped away and you have a consciousness that the main thing, the real thing, the only thing is tied together in some way by its constituent parts. So I'm adding a little personal note to this presentation. I've not done this before, so bear with me for a moment. So remember I told you I was in the shower thinking about this title, and I think the reason I was thinking about the whole presentation because I knew I needed to work on it, and I was traveling on business. But I think I had just heard something about dementia or Alzheimer's on the news that morning, and so I was thinking back to my partner who has dementia. And I do this every day, right? I live in this world of how to deal with, you know, an overwhelming sense of grief and sadness at times. But also, I find myself as a means of survival, I think, thinking about how do I still know who she is? You know, I'm always thinking from the intellectual side, what tells me about that identity? And I think a lot about that because I know that that's still true, right? I don't know that it will always be, but I know that that's still true. So it's like she doesn't ever know where her bridge cards are, but she still plays bridge very well. I know that she had an IQ of 160, and she was tested at that, you know, as a youngster. She obviously doesn't think that she has that now, but part of it is figuring out underneath those characteristics, what are those points in space that make somebody somebody? And it's complicated, right? And it's so not about the details. It's much more about process and how someone thinks about something or how we relate to someone. There's been a lot of written material actually using philosophy as a way to deal with the notion of loss of memory and how to extract from that situation what is actually still there, what's real. I put this phrase up here to help me a little bit. I've collected a whole list of what I call Jennyisms, and they're these kind of wonderful moments of brightness that come out in all kinds of ways at times, and she has a brilliant sense of humor and always has, still does, and sometimes it's best when it's in the mix of her knowledge of her own self and her identity, you know, when she's aware of who she is and where she is in her trajectory. So one day she just looked at me and she said, "I'll start thinking any day now." So I get a lot of that, and that is part of that knowing who she is, right? Even though she can't find her bridge cards. So it's extracting what is detail and what is process. So I think relationships, pattern, the form, I think all of those things are a network of constituent parts. We look for words to kind of tell us about the whole thing. So I'm still in the shower, and I'm thinking about Jenny. I'm thinking about identity stuff and thinking about how I understand that, and I'm thinking about this talk, and then I'm thinking about how is it that we know who somebody is in general. If you're driving down the road and someone whizzes by you and 25 things are going on in that nanosecond, right? I mean, you're texting, you're putting your eye makeup on, you're driving, you're listening to the radio, and someone whizzes by you and you don't even see their whole face. You just say, "Oh, that's Jane Smith. I know it's Jane Smith," right? Or you walk into a restaurant and you see somebody 50 feet away and you just see the back of their head and you say, I know that's Jeffrey because I know how his hair stands up on his head. So what is it about all of that? I mean, that is nuanced stuff because at a primary level, we know we have 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, a head, and we have a specific proportion that we mostly fall into. But that is not how we know who somebody is. We know it by some other collection of data points, right? And it might be the fact that someone smiles in a particular way that is not symmetrical. It may be something much more complicated than that. So I started thinking about all of these things as parallels to one another, as a way of thinking about form. So I've just been talking about natural ways of form, places we see form in our existence, our animate existence. There's also that in the natural landscape around us. I've talked about the Fibonacci sequence, the golden section. Most of you probably know what this is, especially if you're in design. And you know that this ratio is really important to how we think about proportion. And most of you probably know that this phenomenon shows up in all kinds of plant life and probably animal life as well. But this proportion, this ratio, is an ordering system, is it not? It's a way that nature, there's some kind of underpinning there that nature has found that is optimal for growth. So for those of you who don't know, so the Fibonacci sequence, just to give you a little context, is the third number is the summation of the 2 in front of it. And it's that ratio, that relationship that yields the golden section, the golden rectangle, the golden angle. And the angle is what becomes important when you think about sunflower seed heads. And it's fascinating to me that it knows just exactly where and how many pods it can take for optimal growth. And it's all about the number of spirals. The ratio of the ones headed in the clockwise direction and the ones headed in the counterclockwise direction, that ratio comes very, very close, almost always, to the golden section number. So I look at that and I think, well, if nature can do that, we should be doing it that well, right? The things that we make and the things that we do should have that kind of network, that kind of pattern. So then what is the difference between natural and artifactual? When I started thinking about the Form Studio, I think I had run it 1 semester, and I had a close friend, Jay Stuckel, who I used a lot to bounce off pedagogical ideas, and so I asked him that question. And he went to the Quetico in Canada almost every year and canoed, and it's wilderness, for those of you who know, and he said, really, it's about standing in a place like a wilderness and seeing a stone cairn, right? Pile of rocks that someone's put there so that you will notice it. So the question is, why do you notice that? I mean, you have to really ask yourself, what is it about this thing that makes you notice? It has something to do with the way it's put together. And that's artifactual, it's not natural, right? So we're doing something that changes that paradigm when that paradigm is the wilderness. So then the kind of bulk of what I want to talk to you about is how do you teach form? How do you extract that out of students? And I was novice, right? I felt like I was starting in the middle of the sentence when I started all of this. And so I was continually trying to back up and understand it. But one of the things that we know is that there is language, there's spatial language. I think anybody that's in the creative world would say that. We may not always know what the constituent parts of that are, but I think we recognize that there is a thing called a spatial language, and it has syntax and a morphology, semantics. So what we tried to do in the Form Studio is to assign the language some parts. Part of that was so we could talk to each other. Part of it so it would keep us honest as we were moving through this pedagogy. And without that, in terms of product design, we wouldn't know how to pick up a spoon, would we? So something about a spoon tells you exactly how to pick it up. And it has to do with line, it has to do with plane, It has to do with solid, and that ratio can be all kinds of things, which the beauty of that is that there are infinite number of solutions to a spoon. We've not ever designed the perfect spoon. Otherwise, people would have just stopped, right? So the idea is really that there is a balance, but there's a constituent part that falls into some language sequence. So we developed the language, and we actually gave it some graphics, we gave it some words. Part of this was built on what I mentioned about Joseph Ballet's form families. He had developed form families, and we gave it a little longer legs to give us some bigger space to do more with it. He had developed, I think, about 4 to 6 different types of form that he was giving us projects. And so we put it all into 3 categories, what we called modes, and that was line, plane, and solid. But from there, we said, okay, obviously life is much more complicated than that, both in the natural world and in our world. So we added behaviors. So what you see on the left side are rotational, tectonic, and fluid behavior. So we kind of developed some names for that to shorten all of that, but it's the intersection of all of those that we were interested in. So what you're going to see for the kind of eye candy and stuff that I'm going to move through is intersections on that matrix. So we called this the form matrix out of Ballet's family and developed kind of our own intersections in some places. So why is form important? Dissecting products or artifacts is sometimes one way into responding to that question. I start the studio with a discussion about the word fair, or fairing, as a boat builder might articulate. We talk about fair curves or fair planes. If boats didn't have a fair surface, they would resist the water they move through, defeating their purpose. I often begin the discussion explaining the base structure of boats, the lines, planes, and solid masses that compose it. The form either does the work or enables the work of a motor. Airplanes are similar, of course, but water is easier than air to discuss because we can see it behave. A boat explains its form as it moves through the water. So that was always the first place to start, right? To talk about what does it mean to be fair? Because that's something that we could take through the entire sequence of the courses, right? We could keep coming back to that term. We could look at it historically. We could look at it in terms of craft, which was a big part of the studio. But we could also use it metaphorically. And so we did that, and we started with a real abstract exercise. And I'm going to talk back to this at the very end of the talk when we're looking at this idea of what it means to move from abstraction to utility. But we started out with foam blocks. Foam is a great design material for prototypes. It's certainly rampant in product designs, also true, I think, in architecture and interiors. But the important thing was here is that they had to do a perfect square, okay? We wanted to raise the bar and let them know what was the standard. And we started here, and we had to keep pushing that needle for the entire 6 months or so of the studio. So what you're seeing here is the next step in that iteration. And what we would call this now is a solid flow project, right? Pure abstraction, but it was really about fairness, right? And having an idea that was driving that. So in the matrix, I'm going to flip through now several projects in each of those categories, and you can kind of, I think, take with you this idea of fairness as a driver, and then also watch for the increasing complexity as we move through them. So linear flow was the first thing they did after this abstract exercise. And I brought a few friends with me here. And if I don't say so later, please come up and if you want to touch any of these. I've got, 200 of them. And there's been a full exhibit of these things. But linear flow, what they were focused on was line, fair lines, and fluid behavior, okay? And they were given an assignment with this one where they had to cut strips, and they could vary that width, and they could accumulate them up to a certain number. But those were the only limitations. Iteration was absolutely critical so that they were fluent and fluid in their development. The other thing that was important, like this one that I'm holding, we really pushed them to think carefully about how they used glue and welding, right? Use it as it should be used, but when the form could do the work, we wanted the form to do the work. That becomes really important when we start talking about products. So you'll notice in that one before, I don't know if I can go back. Yeah. This one actually has, I think, only one drop of glue in the far end. Everything else is mechanical. And this one has glue on two ends, but it's completely mechanical, very subtly in the center. So half of the class was doing steel work and half were doing wood. And they would switch every 5 weeks. So they were always changing material and medium, but they were still thinking about the same principles. This is another one, no glue with this guy. And this is iteration. And the yield out of this desk was this image. So one of the things we were pushing with every piece that the students would do, every project and then the iterations they would work on, we'd be thinking of what's the next step? Where are we headed? So they could start preparing themselves to move out of line and move into plane. So we did, I'm not really focusing on this, but the students also came up with definitions. They looked at the mathematics behind it, and we tried to keep that really minimalist, so we were always talking in short phrases about that and not trying to get into the weeds about heavy mathematics, but real pure geometry terms. So planar flow was the next project. So we were now thinking about mass of planes, but not necessarily density. And we, for the most part, not in all cases, but almost every case, we used a vacuum former for this. And the mission was to exploit the tool. And most of you may know a vacuum former is handy for using a mold, creating a vessel, something that holds something is not atypical. I think it was designed, right, thinking this is what it's going to be used for. But we asked the students, think about the machine. What can you do with the machine that is unintended? So a lot of people did experiments like this, where they didn't put a full sheet in, so the suction and the heat dissipated differently. But the biggest and most important thing about this project, and in some ways it was probably the most difficult, was that they had to extract form out of whatever mess they generated from the vacuum former. So the biggest part of their work was drawing on these things that would come out of the machine until they got it right. So they would draw and trim and draw and trim and paint, because they would draw so much over the thing before they ended up with the final. And then there were always the inevitable problems, and so apertures became a way of dealing with problems when you otherwise had a very good form. But part of that exercise is to teach them to get rid of the stuff that doesn't matter, right? It's getting back to the extraneous. What is the core? What is the identity of the piece that's in front of you? And the next step was, okay, so now how does that begin to speak to volume and density? How do we move from plane to that? So this one had been through probably 4 or 5 iterations before they ended up with this mass that was left, and then trying to actually extract a fair line. So the fair challenge was even more heightened, I think, in this project than the linear flow, because if you get the wood wet enough and you don't break it and you know how to see that, chances are you're going to get a fair line. This was a bigger challenge. This was an outlier. So this guy decided he was going to make a a planar flow with wood, with the strips from the linear flow project, and actually turn it into a planar expression that actually led to a volume project afterwards. Stringed instruments are another palpable example of form in products. For example, the quality of sound from a violin depends on a painstaking process of shaping the wood of the two symmetrical planes of the body, such that it renders what is called Chladni patterns, an array of sand on the surface of these panels organized by vibration. I don't think it is unimportant that this method of testing construction originates from Ernst Chladni, who was both musician and physicist. The vibration of the strings is transmitted through the bridge of the violin to the body, which in turn translates that vibration into the sound we hear. I would say the planar flow of the wood panels is what ultimately organizes the vibration. So we continue to talk about this idea of how does form do the work? Don't get in the way of the form doing the work. So one of the things we focused on for the entire studio was primitive form. And what we meant by that is that the students couldn't suddenly add a dynamic motor to the thing. I wouldn't even let them add a knife blade, because that meant that in some ways the form was cheating a bit. And what we really wanted them to do was absolutely express the activity of the thing through the form of the object. So one of the things we started talking about as we moved from abstract to utility is this idea of the hand, because the hand was always going to be involved in these products they were going to make. So we would do an exercise where we looked at the form of the hand. So if we're going to make something for the hand, what is the form of the hand? And it's not just the skeleton, right? It's the flesh, it's the musculature, it's all the layers, the material nature, right? The surface, the skin, the embedded structure, and proportion. So we looked at all the things, we extracted from the hand all the things that we were trying to do with the actual artifacts we were working on. So the planar flow product then, by the time we had done the hand work and they'd done the planar flow, they were ready for their first product. And I didn't want to send them down an abstract line too long, because then they would think there was no relationship between that and product. So the next thing was a platter. We wanted to do the platter because the platter could be primitive, and it was always about offering and serving. So the mission was, it had to do that, right? It had to use arms, hands, it had to in some way invite someone else to participate. So you're seeing a couple of examples here, and I'll just mention here as a starter, I was really focused on analog to digital. It was really important for the students to understand there were analog things they needed to learn how to do well, and there was the whole digital world of digital technology. So this becomes really important when you think about where do we go now beyond in terms of our education, in terms of our technologies for building and for craft. So here you see projects that were both slab, ceramics, also CNC milled forms for structuring the slab. And this is this guy here. This is 3D printed. Okay, so this is a platter that also has a kind of a small stand on the bottom. But you'll notice in this slide that the student worked in clay first. And he realized that he couldn't get everything out of his head into the object if he stayed in that material. So he did several iterations between clay and this body. And part of that was CAD modeling. Part of that was foam modeling, but it eventually landed here. And we had students who really did a beautiful job of combining things like a pure analog lathe and then added other dimensions of digital technology to final operations on the piece. And this is one of them. From the hand project I mentioned earlier, we made them work full scale all the time and in charcoal where they could, because it made them very responsible, right, for a good line, and it was harder to do that. But working big also made them always think in scale. And I'm going to just run through a few more of the platters. Again, pay attention to the mission, which was offering, how you carry this thing, and how it does its job in spite of that, right? And we have one more up here too. So this is one that was made just for the fingers of the hand and the kind of bracing of that to actually keep the hand off the top of the platter. So then we moved into tectonic work, and we're still in the plane form, and we're trying to move to the next utility object. But again, in this project, we were making things a bit more complicated. Students needed to work in pattern. They had to come up with a pattern that repeated itself so that they could fully express a joint. So this one was all about joint both in metal and in wood. They couldn't create a unit without creating how it connected to the next unit. And again, we tried to work with them to do mechanical more than other adhesives. And this one also, when it was originally done for the exhibit, we had to do some repair work, but it stood on its own, no glue, and all a series of joints both in each individual unit and in the whole composition. So then we moved into the solid world, and we started with solid flow, remember the matrix? And all of the solid projects started out with the blank, remember the foam blank? Now we moved to a wood blank. So this blank also had to be pure, right? They had to get that right. And they had to do scaled prototypes and multiple iterations before they landed and worked on the actual blank they had made in the workshop. And the beautiful thing about the Solid Flow project is that it really was all about the bandsaw. They did CAD modeling to figure out what the cuts ought to be, but they made 2 cuts and reassembled. That was the rule. So you can kind of see through this cut what was actually happening through these pieces. And here's a bit of eye candy on those. So the next thing, now we're going to move into real tools. Again, primitive, but adopting these principles from the exercises. So the first one was a hand tool that was going to do scooping, scraping, simple kitchen tasks. But again, the issue was the form had to work, both with the hand and the thing in front of it. And this is for all the horse lovers in the room. So this was a prototype in wood, and then there was a metal version that happened after this. And then they did one more abstract exercise, and this was the solid tecto. Remember, they'd done the planar version? So now they had to think, again, a little more complexly about moving forward to the next level. They were invited to use color here only as a way of emphasizing intersection. And then finally, the most complex of all of the projects was the Roto Form. This again involved the lathe, but it involved much more compound geometries. So they would go from the blank that you've seen already to the lathe to turn it down to one form. They would have in CAD already figured out how they wanted to cut this. They could make one cut and reassemble. And the bigger aspect of this project was they had to design it as if they were asking for the hand to approach it. So for example, they might be thinking forward to a garden hose. They may be thinking forward to a tool, a hammer, a kitchen tool. But they had to do it for hand approaching. This was part of a children's toy, ultimately, a children's furniture and toy. This was a handle that the student designed that would become part of his thesis project later. But again, from sketch to lathe to template to cutting it and reassembling. Oops, okay, that didn't play. Sorry about that. That was a video, but for some reason it's not playing. So this is a whole sequence of models, the iterations for that particular, the one that you saw in the video, but also the final version. And this gives you a little bit of a sense of scale. And a few other bits of eye candy. But again, all of these, none of these, this particular project was digital printing. This was all lathe and reassembly. But it would pave the way for the next kind of development of digital technology. So the last two things I'm going to show you are the final iterations from the whole studio. They developed a vessel.
For me, a champagne flute is an example of perfect design because every detail of it is thought out and relevant to the function it performs. So, for example, the height of the glass is used to show off the bead or the string, sometimes it's called, which is that line of bubbles that goes from the point of imperfection, which is always where the stem meets the glass, to the top. And that's a really prized feature of champagne. So they really want to showcase that bead and make it special. It has that very thin, delicate stem, so you just perch onto it so that you don't transfer too much heat into the champagne. So for me, I think it's such a beautiful level of intention embedded in that design. And I think the function of containing champagne in itself is very sophisticated. So it's very interesting to me to try to bring that same level of intention into less glorious functions.
So the students then moved much more heavily into digital technology. So you'll see some of the vessels really were about having to carve out space. And sometimes they did that through porcelain or 3D milling. And sometimes 3D printing with other forms of digital technology. And this was one that actually did a number of things at the same time, moving from lathe to 3D printed components. This was a citrus juicer that was also a vessel. And this little guy's here as well. Okay. Again, the form's doing the work. 3D printing. This is another favorite. So please come up and see those afterwards. I'll say the last thing I want to talk about really quickly is a project, or two projects actually, by Marty Summers, who's actually here in the audience. He's an architecture professor in our college. And as soon as I saw his work with his studio, I realized it was the kind of expanded extension of the form work that I had been doing. And he talks about architecture as performance. And this is an exercise. I mentioned this earlier, that we'd be talking about an abstract exercise. When I saw these, I realized that the whole scale of kind of three-dimensional complexity was now landscape. And this is a kind of an excerpt from his discussion about what this is doing. It's really setting the students up, both I think in terms of technology, but also in terms of what's possible now. And when you look at these, I wanted to say something about the photography of this. The students, when they did the photography of the other form projects, it was looking at it almost architecturally. They saw things they couldn't possibly see when they were actually making it. And this is the other project that Marty's working on. Some of you may know about this project, I don't know, but it's a transit shelter that he's working on for, I think this was on Limestone near the College of Pharmacy. But the thing that's most interesting to me is that it's listening to the land and it's listening to the context to tell it how the form actually comes out of that. And it's actually smart. It's using, trying to capture sunlight and also trying to shed water at the same time. So here's one rendering of it so you can see how the land really becomes part of it. I think one of the most interesting things for me is the roof, because it's both collecting sun in a very specific way, and it's designed to do that, and it's also shedding water, and it also has intelligence in it. So that sunlight is yielding the ability for LED lighting at night, and I think it also has information. So there's a kind of data visualization in this place at all about the weather or about transportation. Solid flow, planar flow, and a night shot.
What is form?
What is form? Form is, to me,
Form is a pleasant shape. No. Sounds dumb.
form is, I don't know why Mitzi's face is just popping into my head right now.
Form a second year studio. Form a...
I don't know.
Ooh, what is form? Well, my definition of form has changed, and it's been growing and expanding and contracting since I've started this whole thing, because it's something I overlooked. Obviously, before I started making my own forms, I overlooked the everyday things around me. Form is
the decisions that you make in between the beginning and the end of a product on how it will fill space.
That's it.
Thank you.